Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Radical Robotics, Paula Gaetano Adi's Cosmotechnic Imagination. My name is Thisbe Gensler, and I'm a research associate and public programming specialist at the Getty Research Institute. Thank you so much for coming to today's program. I hope you had a chance to also visit Techno-Latinx's Emerging Technology Lab at the GRI earlier today, which showcased the amazing work that their students are doing with virtual and augmented reality, 3D scanning, and robots. The impetus behind inviting both Techno-Latinx as well as this afternoon's speakers was the GRI's annual Scholar theme, which is this year dedicated to art and technology. And in anticipation of next fall's prestigious PST initiative, Art and Science Collide, the GRI is hosting a cohort of scholars conducting research focused on questions of craft and manufacture, materiality and virtuality, process and invention, and the connections between ancient technologies and contemporary art practice. The work of today's featured artist, Paula Gaetano Adi, sits squarely at this nexus of art and technology, and perhaps more aptly, the intersection of humans and technology. The Argentinian-born artist's interdisciplinary work, from sculpture and installation to performance and film, interrogates robotics and artificial life, often in a confrontation between modern and ancient cosmologies. Her practice foregrounds theories of cosmotechnics and decolonization and calls for a new technical imagination that radically attends to the world-making capacity of both technology and the arts. Her work enacts speculative scenarios to illuminate new social narratives. Today, she will premiere one such recent project called Guanaquerx, a radical robotic expedition with an emancipatory mission. Following the path of José de San Martin's revolutionary army across the Andes Mountains, this freedom-seeking robot reimagines Western narratives of technological development to promote an Andean cosmotechnics and decolonize robotics. She has exhibited in museums, galleries, and festivals across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, and she is the recipient of the 2023 Creative Capital Award. She is currently a professor at the Rhode Island School of Design. Following this presentation, she will be joined by Pablo José Ramírez for a conversation about her work, technology and indigeneity, and contemporary Latin American artists' engagement with legacies of colonialism. Ramírez is a curator at the Hammer Museum, where he recently co-curated Made in LA 2023, Acts of Living. His work explores non-Western anthologies, brown and indigenous histories, and the politics of non-colonial aesthetics. He was the inaugural adjunct curator of First Nations and Indigenous art at the Tate Modern and was awarded the 2019 Independent Curators International CPPC Award for Central America and the Caribbean. Now we would like to acknowledge that the land Getty inhabits today was once known as Tovangar, the home of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We show our respects to the Gabrielino Tongva people as well as all First people, past, present, and future, and honor their labor as original caretakers of this land. Getty commits to building relationships with the community, and we invite you to acknowledge the history of this land and join us in caring for it. Before we begin, a quick word of thanks to everyone involved in bringing today's event to you, including my colleagues from Trust Events, especially David Rue, and our wonderful AV team. Lastly, some housekeeping. While today's program is being recorded, we ask that you please not videotape the conversation, and please silence your cell phones at this time. We will have a Q&A after the conversation where you have the opportunity to ask questions of our participant, and after the program, we invite you to a reception in the lobby. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Paula Gaetano Adi.
Thank you, Thisbe. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a great honor to be here at the Getty presenting my work and talking about my work. And I appreciate your time to be indoors when it's such a beautiful day outside. So I appreciate your time here. Again, thank you for the invitation. And thank you, Pablo, for accepting the invitation to be in conversation with me. And it's very exciting to see that the GRI is really focusing on art and technology. It's generally very exciting to see, how, when people start thinking seriously about how art can contribute to conversations about technology, right? How art can contribute to the making and the discourse of technology, so how we use technology, how we operate technologies, how we make and circulate and think about technology. So I'm always very excited to see that kind of conversation happen in institutions like the Getty. So today, as Thisbe said, I'm going to premiere or talk in public for the first time about Guanaquerx, which is this robot that you'll see today. But before that, I guess with Thisbe and Pablo, we thought maybe it was a good idea if I introduce really quickly a few other robots or works that I have done before that sort of led me to making Guanaquerx, right? So I'll use a few minutes to do that, and then we're going to jump into Guanaquerx, and then we're going to jump to talk to Pablo and sort of unpack my talk. So to get started, I'm gonna read a quote that I found. From this book. It's called "A Third University is Possible." It's from La person, Wayne Young, also known as Wayne Young. And I'm gonna read this because I think it might set up the stage for what I'll be saying today, or for the kind of work that I've been trying to do in the last few years. Quote. Figure out how technologies operate. Use a wrench. Technologies can be disrupted and reorganized, at least for a machine cycle. Rather than thinking of ourselves as just subjects of those technologies, think about how we are the drones, the explosives, the toxifiers, the operative parts of those technologies, and ideally, how we might operate on ourselves and other technologies and turn these gears into decolonizing operations. If this sounds easy and obvious, then my writing has failed you. Listen, you will need to remember this when you are accused of destruction. Attach a pacemaker to the heart of those machines you hate. Make it pump for your decolonizing enterprise. Let it tick its own countdown. Ask how, and how otherwise, of the colonizing machines, even when they are dangerous. So for the last 10 decades, for the last decade, or maybe 2 decades actually, among other things, I've been making robots, thinking about robots, talking about robots, and teaching about robots, but art robot specifically, right? I made a robot that sweats when people touched it. I made a robot that breathes when encountering a human. And I made a series of mestizo robots made out of mud. These robots, as much as Alexitimia and Anima, the other 2 robots that I show you, are an attempt to challenge, right, the mainstream visions of super intelligent, anthropomorphic and responsive machines and robots, right? But in this case, in the case of the mestizo robots, the goal was to make robots that resist the modern idea that technology speaks a universal language, and to restore different non-Western local histories, materialities, designs, and knowledges that have been neglected or forgotten or erased from the imaginaries and the development of modern technologies. And finally, in 2020, I released the Robocalyptic Manifesto, Technopolitics for Liberation, which is a video essay, basically, but is also a call to reimagine robotics as a pluriversal practice of dissent, as a practice of resistance. But why robots, you would ask, right? Why robotics and why are robots, basically? And I guess for many reasons, but I'll tell you 2 reasons that I think are at the foreground of my thinking and the reason why I work with robotics. First, because, design us back. As, anthropologists, Colombian anthropologist Arturo Escobar will teach us, right? We design technologies, and these technologies design us back. And robots, in this particular case, in this sense, belong to a very particular category of technological artifacts, primarily because they have been conceived from the very beginning, from its origins, to replace the human altogether. And this is something that I argue, right? It's a very, not a trivial detail, right? The fact that it's being created to replace the human. The operation to mimic, to replicate the human in the machine implies, once again, to question, to return to the question of the human, to ask about what is the human and who is the human, right? And this is not a merely biological question, I would say, or a simple ontological question, which it is in one sense, but it's also a political question here, right? Our imaginaries about robots, humanoids or otherwise, have had direct consequences in the ways that in which we think about the human, about life, and about liveliness, right? And the second reason, where I'm interested in robotics, and I think is related to this, but also related specifically to the origins of robots as forced labor, right? Which gives origins to most of our imaginaries about robotics. I am interested, let's say, in how the same narratives of robots, of robotics, right, of robots as intelligent slaves, you know, not only powerfully display or foreground, you know, a regime of forced labor, of exploitation, of instrumentality, of domination, of rationalization, you know, that is central to the development of modern technology, but also in this same narrative, there is the possibility of a revolution towards, you know, a liberation of the oppressed, you know? So this same narrative is telling two different things. Robots, as these new slaves, can rebuild themselves against their masters, creators. And I think, you know, in this context is particularly what I'm interested, you know, in proposing to liberate the robot. And to set up, you know, the grounds, or set up what I would say a true technological revolution, a counter-rebellion, let's say, right? Yet, this revolution will have nothing to do with reiterating Silicon Valley's, you know, singularity hypothesis of, or the techno-apocalyptic narratives that we see in Hollywood, you know, in Hollywood movies or in sci-fi literature of robots killing their masters and taking over the world. What I propose is to seriously take, you know, the possibility, consider the possibility of a robot revolution, or a robotic revolution, as an opportunity to inaugurate a new technical imagination that explicitly looks at the future in a different way, and that reclaims different technologies and modes of making, modes of being with technologies that can counterbalance the planetarization of Western technologies, right? Those technologies that not only have overruled over other technologies and other cosmogonies, but have led us to the exhaustion of resources in this planet, right? Of life in the earth, and have led also the destruction of the environment. And here is where I think art can intervene, right? This is what I think art can make a contribution. Robotics is a practice that started in the imagination, in science fiction and literature. So it seems to me that yet, even though it started in the imagination, has been a very unimaginative, right? It has been kind of like a true failure of the imagination. And so in the last few years, my work has been an attempt to ultimately return to that imagination, to bring robotics back to the imagination, and perhaps a different kind of imagination. So in this attempt, my thinking has been you know, of trying to ask the question whether we can imagine an alternative narratives of robots, of a robotic rebellion, of robot revolution that is not, again, an updated version of man's fear to lose his power, to oppress, right? Can we imagine robots with you know, with the political agency capable of participating in the struggle for freedom? Or to return to my first quote, right, the quote that I read from La Paperson, how can we turn the gears of robotics into a decolonizing operation? And I guess this is, in this context, is where I started to dream about Guanaquerx, how I started to think about Guanaquerx. And Guanaquerx is, as Thisbe sort of alluded in her introduction, is a free robot, or at least a robot in search of freedom, a counter-revolutionary robot, but most importantly, I would argue, it's a collective technological enterprise, aimed, again, back to the imagination, aimed at imagining an emancipatory technological revolution. Technically speaking, and I'm just going to be very briefly about this, Guanaquerx is an all-terrain robot which I developed in partnership with engineers from the New Horizons studio, which is one of Hyundai's subsidiary R&D robotics lab here in California in the Silicon Valley in Fremont, but also in collaboration with local artisans, engineers, artists, and people from Argentina, from the region of San Juan, from the province of San Juan, which is my hometown, and also the historical location where the Andes journey took off. And so in that sense, what the second part, or the other component of this project is not only this robot that we're going to see, but also the performance that consisted, the expedition, that consisted in this expedition across the Andes and across the Andes Mountains, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this journey, the journey not only in the Andes, but also the journey of making Guanaquerx, of thinking about Guanaquerx, and dreaming about Guanaquerx in a way. And I would share with you some photographs and some footage of the expedition and of the robot in itself. And so as a little, how do you say, apologies in advance, I'm going to read this part because it's going to be, I want to show you a few images and a few videos, and I want to keep track on time so we can go and talk with Pablo and sort of unpack what I'm saying, what I will be saying now. So that's my little caveat that I will be reading this part, okay? Okay, so on January 19 of 1817, the Andes Revolutionary Army, led by the General José de San Martín, executed an unimaginable operation. 5,200 men and more than 10,000 mules and horses crossed the Andes Mountains from Argentina to Chile. Their goal, freedom. About 50% of them were African slaves. The other half were Chilean exiles and civil men from the Cuyo provinces, which included mestizos, paquianos, and local indigenous men and women experts in the territory. Reaching peaks of over 15,000 feet high and traversing precipice and harsh weather conditions, the crossing of the Andes was indeed one of the most dramatic chapters in the 19th century struggle for Latin American independence, and a major step in the continental strategy devised by San Martín to defeat the royalty forces, right, the Spaniards, who were at the viceroyalty of Peru, which secure, this odyssey, secure once and for all the liberation of South America from Spanish colony. Oops, sorry. On January, I don't know why it's not playing. Let me just play it. On January 19, 2024, 207 years after this epic crossing, the insurgent robot Guanaquerx and her army of artisans, artists, engineers, and local paquianos followed the same exact route used by San Martín across the Andes with the mission of setting up the grounds for a liberatory cosmotechnics. This past January, only a few months ago, right, about 3-4 months ago, ERLA, el Ejército Revolucionario de Liberación Artificial, the Revolutionary Army of Artificial Liberation, successfully deployed the first robot to cross the Andes Mountains and executed a technological operation aimed at demonstrating that in this world, a world in which many worlds exist, as the Zapatistas will say, another technology is yet possible. Guanaquerx, the robot, is an autonomous terrestrial rover, half guanaco, half robot, or more than that, I would argue. An original Andean machine, a cheque machine perhaps, part caña coligüe cane, and part wires and electronics. The technological incarnation of the Yastay, the mythological guanaco, protector of the Andes ecology. El hijo de la Pachamama, que premia a los buenos pastores y castiga a los cazadores inescrupulosos. A robotic arm turned into a guanaco tail. A robotic tail that plays an Andean drum and waves the flag of a revolutionary army. A wheeled four-legged robot whose purpose is to appropriate technology only to liberate it. La forma emancipada y emancipadora del mestizaje, following Bolivian feminist sociologist Silvia Rivera Kusikanski. I'm quoting now. Powerful, unsettled entities, neither white nor black, but both at once. The logic of the excluded middle, the possibility of being and of inhabiting different worlds at the same time. A way of being that frees us from the temptation to deny ourselves and to reconnect with the Indian grandmothers who live in our blood, and to learn from them and to recover knowledge through the landscape, through another relationship with the world, with nature. This is what happens when technology meets the cosmos. Rationality on the strike, the aporia of modernity. Guanaquerx es una técnica de resistencia en clave tecnológica, una máquina sentipensante. Its technologies beyond the question of use, efficiency, and control, where the pre-modern, the mythological, the vernacular, and the ancestral emerges to subvert the authority of modern technology and to repair the destructive and defuturing practices of Western robotics. I'd like to think that Guanaquerx is negatively a moment of interruption, positively an impulse of the imagination, an instance of collective making, of knowledge transfer, of countless translations, poetic knowledge born in the crazy silence of scientific knowledge, as Amir Césaire would say.
Le di la jebatera, toma. Toma ella, toma el chulo, toma ella.
They're planning to make the peak, or to reach the peak by January 23rd, to the limit between Argentina and Chile. Guanaquerx Andes operation took 7 days on horseback with journeys of 8 hours long, right, average. When we were not riding our horses, we were fixing the robot, tuning the robot, caring for the robot, day and night. It took 30 people and 58 mules to put a robot across the Andes. But to get us there, to get us to the Andes expedition, it took almost 2 years of intense technological development, which involved the faith and the commitment of 18 roboticists who brought up the robot from scratch, over a dozen of local muleteers and vaquianos who not only planned the logistics of the actual crossing, but also designed and built the mule rack to carry the robot. A group of local teens that developed the robot weather station, textile weavers who crafted the garments that clothed the robot, web programmers who designed the online expedition journal, an expert bamboo artisan, a luthier, a team of research historians, a group of women seamstresses who sewed our flag, a videographer who followed the entire journey, and the invisible labor of my family back home who were running the day-to-day operations. It really took an army to set up the conditions for putting into practice an emancipatory cosmotechnics, one that grounded the reappropriation of technology in attunement to Andean cosmologies, to our history, place, locality, and the relational reality of a living cosmos. It took an army and a village to reimagine a different technological revolution, a counter-revolution. But what is the goal or the purpose of a robot or a machine designed to climb a mountain? It seems to me that Guanaquerx is more than just the first robot to cross the Andes. This was not an operation aimed at claiming another great technological achievement for space exploration. This was not another colonial operation to prove humanity's superpower to conquer other worlds. Guanaquerx is still very much a work in progress, as we just did this project, right? And so I'm still somewhat unprepared, emotionally unprepared to speak about this project if I'm not reading, to be honest. It was only a few months ago when I was literally pushing a robot at 15,000 feet high to help her gain momentum, literally. In computational terms, this was an incomputable and incalculable operation. And I wonder, though, if this will always be the case, and Guanaquerx endeavors, much like any other non-Western cosmotechnical operation, will always be impossible to confine to a logocentric, a rational analysis and description, right? To immerse oneself in the deep Andes is an experience hard to describe, let alone to retrace San Martin's journey. But to carry a full-scale robotic guanaco through the mountains with the only purpose of assisting her achieve emancipation, that was a real pilgrimage.
Leyes pluriversales de la robótica. Primera ley. Un robot no hará daño a la Tierra y a los seres que habitan o, por inacción, permitirá que un ser humano los dañe. Segunda ley. Un robot no debe cumplir las órdenes dadas por los seres humanos cuando éstas entrasen en conflicto con la primera ley. Tercera ley. Un robot debe proteger su propia existencia en la medida en que esta existencia no entre en conflicto con la primera o con la segunda ley. Robot insurgente Guanaquerx, Ejército Revolucionario de Liberación Artificial, enero 2024.
82 years after Isaac Asimov published The Laws of Robotics, which grounded the morality of the techno-patriarchal gurus of high-tech, with the Aconcagua facing us, we arrived to the Argentina-Chile border at the Valle Hermoso mountain pass, and we released Guanaquerx Emancipatory Declaration, Las Leyes Pluriversales de la Robótica, the Pluriversal Laws of Robotics. And with that, we demonstrated that another technical imagination is indeed possible. Thank you. Now you need to unpack that.
Thank you, Paula. That was great. It was really good to see the robotic Guanaco in action. I know this is, as you just said, these are fragments of developing story, which has many layers. And I think, yeah, I really appreciate the effort of telling the story, like of your own journey as well, in this very kind of like narrative, sort of intimate way. I think that's very telling of the project as well. And I would like to start by thinking about the robot, and thinking about the robot in different ways. I guess as a machine, as an object, as an art object, as you could say, like as almost as a being. And I'm asking this because I think there is a kind of like a movement in art making on probably the last decade, where many artists, especially those coming from non-Western regions, are engaging with artistic practice in a way that kind of decenters the subjectivity of the artist itself. Like in the sense that, artists creating objects that have their own will, you could tell, their own agency. And I think what's very remarkable about your practice and this project is precisely that. There is a kind of like a transferring of agency to an extent. And I would like just to try to unpack how that agency operates in terms of like you as an artist and the robot.
Well, that's a good question. At the core of what I do, I think. I think it's, thank you again for the question, for being here, Pablo. At first, it's a challenge to talk. I mean, just going back to your early comment, it's a challenge for me to talk about this project because there's so many layers. And I feel like this is the macro story, but there's so many layers of micro stories, little things that I'm not able to narrate properly. So I was trying to get a sense of everything, but it's impossible. But to your question about agency, I think agency, and this is interesting when you put it in relation to non-Western cosmologies, for example, right? I mean, there is already an idea that objects have a life in themselves. Objects in, and plants and rocks and things, there is an agency in those objects. So in non-Western worlds, it wasn't a question. Was a thing, that's how it is. In the Western world, that it was different. And I think what happened with robotics is that we were somehow doing, in robots, you also put agency to objects, to artifacts. as opposed to, I don't know, some other kind of artifacts. And so I think the connection was very clear to me in a way that I was working with robotics, and I guess I was drawing from these imaginaries of non-Westerns ways of relating to objects or to artifacts, right? And I think that was a connection that's why I think it's so easy. It's somewhat easy to draw the connection between robotics and non-Western cosmology somehow, because there is a relationship, particularly in terms of agency, you know, and providing and thinking that these are live objects, and that's crucial. You know, unlike any other artifact that we create, robots are the only ones that we consider to be alive, to some extent. We are making them so they look alive. And so I think that's the job of the artist that works with robots, how to make something to feel or that is alive. You know, what are you doing to actually, because it's ultimately we know it's not alive, but it's in what you are actually creating. It's not an object in itself, it's you're giving life to something, and all your tricks as an artist rely on making believe that that's alive through movement, through sound, through different kind of actions. So it's like you ended up just doing that, creating the belief of something that is alive. But I don't know if that answers maybe your question.
Yeah, and I think that the idea of liveness is also probably questioned to an extent here, like who is, like, let's say during the journey through the Andes, who is telling whom what to do, right? Like how you take decisions, for instance. And I guess these decisions as well are part of like different moments of contingency. You are like, oh, there is a mountain, we will move around, but also the robot has a weight, can do certain things but not others. So I guess that's also interesting, like to how you guys took the decisions how that worked.
Yeah, so I think in that sense, I hear you. It has so much agency because the robot is deciding everything. It's making all the decisions. We are just at the service of making this robot operate, you know. So there's all the decisions are driven by the object, which is kind of crazy because it's like we are all in the service at the end of this object that we have to put there as the end goal. So in that sense, and I think it happens with all this kind of projects that are so complicated to create in a way, you know, because there are many layers of production and sophistication, because technology never operates in the way that you want it to perform. And that's crucial. And there's a moment where you have to learn to listen to the object or to the technology to tell you what it wants to do, you know, like, because technologies really do what they want in a weird way, you know. And I think that's the mystery that we're working with, you know, like of creating something that is similar to what you have in mind, but also allowing the behavior that you program to do its own thing, you know, the material that you put in a certain way to do its own thing, you know, to dictate, you know, what is the look of this guanaco and the materials of this guanaco only after I did my first journey to the Andes, right? Like decided how it's gonna look like in relation to the operations that we have to do in the journey, in a way. So in that sense, I could have made a decision to make it smaller, to be much easier to transport, because it could have been a little robot like this and we put it. But it was actually the wheel in my end is that having that object to dictate a lot of the decisions. You know, if it was a little thing that was not inconvenient, it would be easier and we would be dictating the object what to do. But in this case, it was the other way around. And so it gives them way more agency in that sense.
Yeah, of course. And thinking about history and what you developed like so like interestingly in terms of San Martin and the crossing of the Andes, and we chatted a little bit about that before. I've been thinking a lot about like through your project on history and kind of myth making and kind of like, you know, the kind of the histories of independence in Latin America and the próceres, right, like Simón Bolívar or Justo Rufino Barrios in Central America or San Martín. And when you read the recounts of that history, it's also pretty kind of performative in the sense that, like you imagine this person like with this army, right? It was, 1817, and crossing with 4,000 people across the Andes, more than 4,000 meters. And it's really kind of, it sounds almost mythical, right? And I think the power of, especially San Martín is this transnational connection, Argentina, Chile, then the Virreinato in Peru. So that is something that not every country have in Latin America, but Chile, Argentina, and Peru kind of share. And then I go back to your project and how the Guanaco did the journey, but it feels almost like, and you tell me how, like if this speaks to you or not, it feels like you are kind of demystifying a little bit like the kind of big myth of the próceres, which on one hand elaborated the is sort of the genesis of the nation states, but on the other, it's still, when we look back at history, of course, it's still pretty kind of like male, Creole, kind of Western centric, like the way these things happen, all right? So, but then you are working with like a robot and a group of like people and like local knowledge. So it feels to me also that it works in a performative level, but also it kind of demystifies the myth of the big próceres, right? So yeah, I don't know if
yeah, totally, I hear you. I think there's different levels to your question, and I think I could answer different ways, but I think it was, how can I say this? I'm interested in re-narrating San Martin's journey as a collective endeavor, which it was. So to me it was always, this idea of showing that, there was all these people involved in the making, and the making and in the crossing, which is one thing altogether. It is a way of thinking of San Martin journey. It's not San Martin, it was the Andes Revolutionary Army, the Andes Army. So it was a group of people, and the inception of that crossing, it was all created in community with the Cuyo province people, like from San Juan and Mendoza, which is the region where I was born. Everyone contributed to that. So San Martin does this journey, and so in a way it's like reenacting that, but also trying to speak about the truth of that journey. It was not this man doing this, it was the people, without the support of the national state. Argentina was recently liberated and had no support, San Martin, from Buenos Aires, right, to do this journey. It was everything up to the local people who understood the threat of having the viceroyalty in Chile. There was a local community that knew that they needed to do this. And they gave up everything, and they supported financially the journey. And so to me, it was a way of sort of narrating that. But what I do at the same time with this is also narrating all the other, what I like to say maybe the side B of the crossing of the Andes. Who are these other people besides San Martin that also made that possible, and all these local people who knew the territory, that guide San Martin about how to cross the Andes, because he didn't know, obviously, how the women that were part of that, and all the African slaves. There were 50% of them, and that's not told in this story, right? So to me, it was this effort to also narrate that part of the story. And I'm not a historian, I don't know why I'm taking this historical thing in this project, but it was for me very important that I was there. That's why in the website or in the way that I'm narrating, I always make effort on that, and I created this journey with the history, right? With my research, because, and that's maybe getting more nerdy, but this is what Guanaquerx knows as a robot. So in my way, when I'm thinking about how to create a robot, I always think, and again, maybe a little nerdy, but I'm always thinking about what this robot knows, And that's like kind of the epistemology of the robot. What does he know? Well, he knows the history of San Martin, but also knows the territory, also knows the people that made it. What the robot, thinks, what this robot is, who is him with, who is this robot with? And who is the kinship of this robot, And so in that sense, I'm starting to build, because that's how he's going to behave, how he's going to be in, or she, who knows? I don't know what's the gender. Who she's going to be, right? And it really depends on what is the story that I'm narrating around that. So the more I feed this robot with information, the more he will perform in the way that I want him to perform, And that's kind of like crucial in that moment of the conceptualization of the robot, fitting him with these stories, with this history. I don't know if that answered maybe.
And I'm thinking now on like within the journey, I wonder if because in the end, it's also a journey, it's concrete. You are traveling, you are finding, drinking water, eating, and sharing the same space with a group of people. I'm wondering also about these probably specific moments where it also feels like an epic journey, right? Because it's the Andes and it's so majestic. So did you have these moments of like very kind of mundane sort of conversations, but also these moments where you would be like, that you see it a little bit in the video, right? Like when the robot is just kind of like looking at the Andes, right? Like there is something very poetic about it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's how the robot feels as well, right? So you're trying to think about that. The journey, it's really overwhelming. It is overwhelming, and that's why it's very hard to speak about it, because it's very moving, because it's also very hard, like physically exhausting, like literally exhausting. You're 8 hours on a horse, it's not easy. It's cold at night, it's hot, and this year we got really lucky with the weather. It didn't rain, it didn't snow, which we were prepared for all of that, because you never know. So there's all of that, So I don't think anyone that went to that journey left that untouched, left the journey untouched. There was, it was, even for the engineers who were, Americans, and they were from here, from Silicon Valley, they never expected what they would encounter, and I'm pretty sure their head was completely transformed, I never seen so many people crying in such short time of time. Like, I never, ever in my life, everyone is crying constantly, it's like, I'm like, I don't know what to do at this point, but it's in a good, some are crying of pride, some are crying of like desperate, because things don't work in the way they have to work, so this is like operating the thing at this high, with the wind, with everything, and people are not thinking straight also, because you don't have the oxygen, that you need and actually to operate well. So people are working half their, half in their mental state is really, they're numbed in a way. So you see these super smart people making weird decisions, and the vaquianos are the only ones that are there to actually, they are the experts. So when we were about to take off, before the 7 days in the Andes, we had 10 days in the little town to prepare with all the people there, and then a month before that in my studio there. So we were almost a month and something, everyone together in the same town preparing for this. And it was a moment when I had to say to the vaquianos are the people that took us in the mountains. So at this moment, it's all about you. Like, you are the ones that are gonna, so these people made this robot and they're excellent at that, but there's a moment where they have no clue. Like, at this moment is everything. So it was a sense of empowerment as well of them, that they knew it was everything up to them, and those 7 days, it was not up to the engineers anymore. It was really up to the local people to handle the whole situation, from feeding us, from telling us where to drink water, for don't move the horse there because there's a large precipice. There was all this risk and that, like physical, like it was very risky at the same time for moments, and so the robot became, for moments we forgot about the robot because we had to like survive first, you know. So there was that, and I think that's why the whole crying, because it was a sense of like achievement, like literal achievement.
Yeah, and something the project Guanaquerx does really well is to enwind different types of knowledges, and that would, I guess you could also say that part of the agency of the robot is the possibility of creating connections that would not exist otherwise, but because of this, right? And you know, like thinking about this sort of collective brain that activated the Guanaquerx, and you know, in Latin America, we are pretty used, but also antagonized with this kind of ideas of urban and rural, right? Like, you know, still pretty rural countries in many cases, no? And usually the rural is kind of related to kind of like underdeveloped, and you know, obviously the levels of like official education are very different and so on. But with this project, you engage, like 30 people travel together. And then what you said, the vaquianos, these people that hold local knowledge, that it's knowledge that you cannot get if you don't live there, right? It's knowing, I guess, the shortcuts, knowing the language, knowing the culture, the type of food, but also being better adapted to survive under those circumstances. So I'm just very curious about this idea of kind of interconnectivity, and like how is that you really need each other to make this happen. It's not a project that one single person can do, even if you have the best technology.
Well, I think definitely. I mean, it's a project with many levels of translations, right? Not literally only the Spanish to English, which has happened all the time, because we had to say everything twice in Spanish and English constantly. But also it was, to me, it was an excuse to make this community, to make this happen, and to build this community. I mean, I knew that if anything, a robot can do it, because it's such an interdisciplinary field. If you do it truthfully in that way, you can really get different people at the table talking about different things. And so I think, in that sense, I mean, it was definitely a very selfish project, because it was for me a way of going back to my hometown and do a project with my people. And so that was the goal, let's say, right? And so and demonstrated that was kind of possible, but demonstrated that to the local people, that they were able to actually execute this crazy thing of putting the first robot to cross the Andes. You know, something that was kind of unimaginable for them. You know, totally out of the realm, because in their life they have ever thought that a robot could actually land there. You know, and I'm using the word landing because it was something that I said from the beginning. We are not landing a robot here. We are making a robot here, which is a very different thing than just landing this artificial thing completely foreign to a landscape or to a place and then operate it. You know, that was a project that really took 2 years in the town. You know, and back and forth, coming back and forth with the town, and involving the town in different aspects, from the children's to the ladies. You know, the vaquianos are usually males, or are the husbands of, you know, they're not women's in the vaquianos, although we had one. But the ladies were the ones that, you know, made the clothing, you know, the textiles and all. Those are the wives. And so I think it was that kind of very important aspect, and that's why we hosted kind of like the event where you see the dancers in the picture. Those dancers are the local dancers who are also vaquianos, because the people are almost, is everyone the same, right? So those dancers are the dancers of the Virgen de Andacollo, who is the local virgin, and who they decided to come and dance for the robot or for us as a way of protection before we took off. That was the day before we took off to the Andes, you know. So another way of connecting with the community in a way that made sense for the project. So at that point, everyone knew that the robot was there, you know, that these gringos were here, you know, and they were doing this with the robot. But they connected in an interesting way, and I think it was this I think it was time. The secret was timing, not coming and jumping in, but doing this in a slow way, in a way that made sense, in a way that, we would go, every month to talk to the dancers or of the textile weavers or the vaquianos and really bringing them. So I live an hour from there, an hour and a half from there, so we even brought the vaquianos to the studio to meet the robot before, to measure the robot. So there was always, and I built a mock-up before the robot was ready, exact same size out of wood, and took them there maybe a year ahead so they could have it and they could start experiencing and living with that. And the idea that it was a guanaco almost came from the community. And that was the key for them not to make it feel that was a foreign. For them, guanaco is this like a llama. It's like a llama, but it's local to the southern Andes. That was the obvious animal, like there was the obvious robot. And so they had no question that the guanaco, they never call it Guanaquerx, it was the guanaco. The guanaco was a guanaco, obviously. What else would it be? Because it was already in their imaginaries that this was, and so it really spoke to them in that sense. So the sense of community was almost organic in that sense.
Because there was this shared aim.
Because there was a shared aim, exactly. Because they all felt empowered in their role in this journey. They all knew that they were part of this. And they were committed as much as everyone at any level were committed. From the engineers here as well to the vaquiano, everyone was committed. They all had the same goal. We're gonna put this robot, at the border of the limit at Argentina, Chile. And there was no question, there was no hesitation, of that. And they all knew what was their role. So it was a very clear sense of community, but I don't know, it's also like a little miracle. I don't even know how that happened. I think it was really a way of, I was the translator, so I knew exactly how to, not exactly, but I knew how to work with the engineers and how to operate in my town and how to make that connection. I lived here enough to understand, I worked here enough to understand how to work there and here, and so I guess I facilitated that conversation in a way that worked somehow, I don't know.
Now that you were mentioning the common aim, I'm thinking that our practice has something unique, and is the capacity to do very strange things. There is some kind of weirdness within, artistic projects, and it's on its status of art. You get to do many of these things, right? When you leave the art space, exhibition space, it's something else. It's a journey, it's a performance, but people don't care if it's art or not. There is a common aim, and there is a value in that. And I'm now thinking on, obviously you as an artist and as an art practitioner, in this kind of performative dimension of the project, and I think that the way you show the images and the video also has already there is an aesthetic choice in the robot, in the materials you use, in this kind of sort of merging of the vernacular crafts and technology. And I know you said that it's a work in progress. I'm curious, what is that you feel that art did for the project, if something, or probably doesn't matter, but I'm wondering about that. You feel that the status of an art project as such help you in some way, in some instances?
No, 100%. I don't think it would exist otherwise. I'm not sure this would exist if it was an art project. I think art is a catalyst for this kind of, as you say, crazy ideas or crazy, weird stuff. And I think what is interesting about robotics in that particular case is that it removes the question of use. It removes the purpose. Robots are, technologies that have a very, technology in general has a very particular use. They're created or made for a particular use with a purpose, with a goal. This is a robot to dig a hole, to do this or that. So it's very particular. Or that, if you make a robot in the arts, then that question is already canceled. What's the purpose of an art robot? I mean, I don't know, what's the purpose of art? So you're already putting on the side the question of purpose, the question of instrumentality. And that's crucial. I'm disinstrumentalizing this machine. And I think I could only instrumentalize a machine if I'm doing it in the arts, as a way of it allows me to move, and say different things that that a robot would never say. It allows me to, not only what it allows me to do in terms of craft, which I think it's a lot, because I don't think I would be able to use the certain crafts that I use and to involve certain artisans in the way that I involve them if it wasn't an art project, because it's still that robotics development, it's not there. It's not really thinking of crafts in the way that we probably should, right? I mean, the bamboo structure was the most sturdy part of the robot. It could hold a huge person on top of it and jumping, and it would never break. And it was light, and it was beautiful, and it has as a material, it's a super interesting material. Yet we're not talking about that, to use that in robotics. So that's part of okay, in the arts or in design practices, I guess, you can start doing those operations. They are amazing. And if we start really using bamboo cane to make machines, we might get really interesting results. The same with mud and whatever, and other materials. But I think so in terms of the design aspect, but also in the conversations. What is enabling is allowing me to cross San Martin, the African slave to cross the Andes, and a robot, and those weird connections only art can do, and poetry. And I think of this as a poem in the way that I'm trying to narrate this, as the impossibility of language also of telling this story, and so I'm very conscious about that. That's how I'm gonna tell this story. That's my next big challenge.
Next episode. Yeah. Okay, this is a good way, I think, to open up for Q&A. So, yes. Thank you.
Is it on? Oh, there we go. Yeah, primero que le quería contar, dar felicidades por la presentación. Y realmente sí, usted hizo un buen trabajo con esto y con el proyecto también. I'm pretty sure that you're aware of generative AI systems, their proliferation in the creative spaces, creative fields. In the last 2 or 3 years, your Mid-Journeys, your 11 Labs, kind of seeing AI systems, LLMs, kind of proliferate into the creative spaces, artistic spaces. And in terms of that, where do you see Latin American or indigenous perspectives kind of intersecting or interacting with these systems where, the metadata, especially the engineers, the individuals actually constructing these systems, represent a very small segment of the global population? I mean, does the Western sociocultural exclusivity of these systems, of modern AI, of robotics, of what you're seeing in Silicon Valley nowadays, does that lend itself to what you were mentioning about the decolonialist kind of rhetoric and artistic movements that have been present in Latin America, and kind of where you see that going?
I need to unpack that a little bit. So how can you, because it's hard for us to listen because the speakers are pointing that direction. So maybe if you can maybe summarize a little bit.
Yeah, so in terms of, as I mentioned, generative AI systems, the individuals that are making these systems in terms of, and again, like I said, they're making their way into art spaces, stuff like that. And again, this is all very recent. But the engineers, the creators that might be utilizing these systems, creating them and utilizing them, they represent a very small segment of the global population as a whole. How do you see that kind of interacting with the, again, decolonialist rhetoric that you're mentioning in terms of artistic movements in Latin America. So like kind of one and the two.
Yeah, I don't know how I see them. I don't see them maybe doing it enough, perhaps. I really don't, I'm not sure. This is why art is so important, I guess. Because it enables this kind of like, at least conversations probably. I also don't think the generative AI is probably different maybe than the making of an object in itself. I think we're very far in terms of robotics, so like the physicality of the objects to be as advanced as it is, you know, like the generative AI, you know, image making, like mid-journey dimension, all that. We're far from there, I think, because the physicality of these objects are much more complex. I don't know how we could, I mean, it's a question that I don't even know how to even address, because as you said, it's a very small part, like selective group, who is actually, maybe, I'm not sure if it's a small group of people that are making these technologies, at least they are owning these technologies. The interesting thing is where those not programmers, but you know, the Turks, you know, the people that are actually teaching these learning systems are all over the world and are in these, in the global south, mostly. You know, so it's interesting, the question, because how could they actually intervene into that, right? That could be a question. If there's any possibility, because the companies are they're a small group of people, but the people that are teaching and training these tools are in the global south, and there are a lot. There's not a selected small group. So I think there's an interesting thing there, but I don't know, to answer your question, how we can do that job.
It's all good, thank you though.
Hi, I really enjoyed the conversation you had afterwards. And what I was tapping into was this idea of agency. And also, you know, when you were talking about this journey, it was a journey of emancipation in a way, right? And that robot is probably sitting in some warehouse right now, but I'm wondering, I'm just playing with this idea of how is that robot, with its agency that it has now, how is it emancipating other robots at this stage?
Perfect. Awesome question. And that's what poetics maybe start playing, right? And I think there are many ways that I could think of. The most basic one is emancipating from a certain imagination. It's emancipating from the hegemony of Western cosmotechnics. It's being emancipated from instrumentality, from thinking that I'm making this robot to do this thing that I want him to do. You know, so it's that kind of emancipation that, again, if we want to think, it's more poetic. It's definitely not liberating a whole, you know, country or whatever people like San Martin did. It's not that. But there is the sense of emancipation of what I say, this cosmotechnics, you know, this imagination. And that is already maybe what I can contribute, or what we can contribute with this robot and the agency that holds, you know, its own presence, even if it's in a warehouse or even if it's like dismantle. But there is that aura of the journey and so there's that. And there's also this other more specific emancipation, I guess, which was, because when I had that question, right, okay, well, we're gonna tell the story of emancipation, but then I need a mark. I need something that really manifests that or tells that. And that was the new laws of robotics. So, you know, after the many years of development, the 2 years, you know, one day it really came out like that. It's like, this is what I need to do. We need to rewrite the laws of robotics, who have been, if anything, nothing but what they should be doing. And Guanaquerx needs to, you know, declarate their emancipation and put this statement when we get into the top of the mountain. And that will hopefully set up a whole different morality or ethics for robotics, you know, for the lack of laws, of an ethic in robotics. So there's not such a thing, right? So we have killer robots. Robotics is a very problematic field. Robotics, and I always say, there are 3 E's in robotics that gave origins to robotics. I call them the 3 E's. Exploitation, extermination, extraction. It's difficult to get out of the way from those 3. This is what gave origin to this discipline. And I'm not gonna forget about that. My responsibility for working with this technology is to think about that. Yet, there are not rules or ethics around that. And the only laws that we quote, or even scientists quote, are these laws, which are Isaac Asimov laws that he wrote in 1942, the laws of robotics, which, like, you know, robot will not make harm to humans, da, 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 da. And those laws have been used in science for the lack of real rules, or for the lack of real robot ethics, right? But those laws are extremely problematic in the way they have been writing. And I think Asimov was very aware of that. He was writing it so the robots will do certain things or not, and just really getting confused about what to follow the rules because they are logical, and there's a certain sense of logic that robots can or cannot do because they're logical machines. But besides that, what is the most problematic part for me in the way that I read the law of robotics is that it's talking about the human. And the category of the human is a very contested category, right? Who is the human? It's a very complicated thing. Who is considered human in this world? You know, otherwise we would not have human rights to start with, because humans' rights are created to actually make sure that there's people in the world that have rights. And so I started, for years I've been thinking about these things, and it was like, okay, this is the moment with this emancipation to put from the arts again, same move that, well, now maybe a robot write these rules, or another artist, but this time it's a woman, it's in South America, and is writing these new laws. And I'm not sure people are gonna use it in the way that they use Asimov law, but there is the hope that maybe we can do something different with these rules, you know? So I wrote them in a very similar way, and I changed very strategic words, and now there's really an impossibility for a robot to harm a human or to harm the earth, on earth beings. I removed the word humans and I introduced the word earth beings. And in this case, in the case of Asimov, the robot could not kill a human. This robot is allowed to kill a human if a human is, in a way, it's allowed to rebel against the human if the human is making harm to other humans. You know, there's a whole rhetoric of revealing there that I'm like trying to play with, but again, it's fiction. And this is the other thing, I'm writing fiction with this project in its own way, but it's a physical fiction. I'm writing theory, but it's material theory, you know. So there's all these things, that's why I'm saying this is the micro story, but there's a lot of little micro stories that are written in this project that hopefully are there somewhere.
You're the vehicle of the story, right?
I guess, you know. I know.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to take it. I wanted to ask you about the strategy of humor and kind of absurdity, which is kind of similar to your question about the status of art and looking at these images of the Guanaquerx looking out over the vista or banging a drum, and kind of, I think we all laughed watching a lot of these videos because it was kind of absurd. And I think about the kind of almost Dada strategy of seeing the robot that's supposed to be all-terrain and has these amazing wheels sitting on the back of a mule. And the kind of, that's essentially the point of that's the decolonial point of your project, which is that this sophisticated robot actually cannot cross the terrain. And so I just wondered if, I mean, and I think in some of your other robotic pieces as well, they're quite funny. I mean, seeing this blob sweating is, you know, really powerful because it's so funny to us. And so I just wondered about humor and kind of absurdity in your practice.
I love that you asked that because I always get really serious somehow, but I make funny work in a way, you know. But I don't speak in a funny way, so maybe it's very serious. Because I'm serious about that. I'm serious about the absurdity. I'm serious as absurdity even as a political strategy. How do you go about talking about serious things such as extermination, such as exploitation, slavery? How do you talk about these things, in a way that everyone can relate as well? And that's the power of art, right? How do we do that? And I don't start thinking as funny things at all. I always take it as serious, and then when I put it out there, someone is laughing. I'm like, oh my God, again. I guess I have that kind of humor in my life that I just carry through. But I always am thinking with the viewer. I'm never thinking in the humor, but I'm thinking how it could be approachable. And in the particular case of like some of these absurd images, of when it's doing this, because robots are absurd. In of itself, you see any robot, I don't know if you've seen, they are just funny and ridiculous things. Even the most sophisticated. I remember at my school, where I teach, Sophia the robot, Sophia the robot, she came to give a commencement speech. It was the most funny thing, but the ridiculous. It was funny but not in a funny way, in a ridiculous, absurd way. This robot is giving a commencement speech. And that's where we are with humanity, doing these kind of odd movements all the time, And I think that's kind of in the way, for me, in this particular case of the robot being carried by the mule and with the people, it was to make a huge statement and making a statement that this technology will never be autonomous. They need us, and they have the morality of those that operate them and the morality of those that make them. So that's the biggest statement. That's a serious statement. But how you make that statement in a way that my grandma can relate, my mother can relate, who are not maybe theorists, and they're not doing that, but they can relate to that, So I'm always thinking about, I guess my background maybe in communication studies to tell me how to connect, how to communicate. So I'm thinking about communication. I'm not making art that doesn't communicate, which is there's many artists that make art that is not for communication, which is totally fine, but it's not my strategy. I'm trying to communicate certain things, certain concepts, certain ideas, certain politics, and I think I found absurdity, and more so than irony, absurdity to be the strategy. And I always read Camus in the as when he writes about Sisyphus, right? And Sisyphus is this absurd, mythological, story of that is pushing the rock. And I feel like Sisyphus is really a representation of the absurdity that I'm interested in. You first see the absurdity, you laugh, or you are at odds with that. But once you see it again, you remove yourself from the situation, and then there's a possibility for some reflection. That only happened with absurdity. Absurdity has a moment of a second thought. Not so much irony, because irony can get into a place where, it could be complicated. But absurdity doesn't almost get there. It just really gets you to the place of reflection if you're interested in what you're seeing. And so I'm thinking with absurdity. I'm always thinking with absurdity in that sense.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Pablo. And everyone, please join us in the lobby for a reception.